Okay. So have you ever noticed, like, when you hear a comedian tell a joke, it's hilarious.
Yeah.
But then if you try to tell that same joke to someone else, it just falls flat.
Oh, yeah, totally. I think we've all been there.
It's like it's not just the words, it's the whole how they tell it,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. It's the delivery, the timing, the emphasis, those little pauses. It all adds up.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today. The whole how of public speaking.
That's right. We're looking at this chapter that's all about delivery and how to really make your message connect.
Because you can have the best content in the world. But if your delivery is weak,
It's not going to land.
exactly. It's like having a Ferrari with flat tires. What's the point?
And even if your content isn't perfect, yet a strong delivery can really elevate it, make it engaging and keep people interested.
So we're talking about nonverbal communication.
Right. All the ways we communicate without actually using words. Our voice, our body language,
Yeah.
it all plays a role.
So today is to figure out how to use all of that to become more effective speakers.
Exactly. We're going to break down what makes for good delivery, look at the different ways to deliver a speech, and then we'll get into the specifics of using your voice and body language to your advantage.
Plus, we'll talk about the importance of practice and how to handle those tricky audience questions.
Sounds good. Let's jump in.
All right, so first things first, what exactly is good delivery?
Well, the chapter tells this great story about Wendell Phillips. He was a prominent abolitionist back in the 1800s, and this student traveled over 20 miles to hear him speak in Boston.
Wow, dedicated.
Right. But when the student got there, he was surprised. Phillips wasn't this loud, booming orator. He was speaking very conversationally, just standing there with one hand on a table. The student thought the speech would be maybe 20 minutes.
Oh, I bet he was in for a surprise.
He was. When he finally checked his watch, an hour and a half had gone by. He was completely captivated.
That's amazing. So I guess the takeaway is that good delivery doesn't have to be showy or over the top.
Exactly. It's about being clear, engaging,
Yeah.
and not distracting.
The chapter mentions that audiences generally prefer a delivery style that's kind of a mix between formal and conversational.
Yeah, like you're having a conversation with them, but with a bit more structure and purpose.
So things like being direct, using vocal variety, facial expressions, really connecting with your listeners.
Right. It's about being authentic and engaging.
Now, of course, delivery is an art, not a science. So there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
What works for one speaker or one audience might not work for another.
But there are definitely some fundamentals you can focus on.
Absolutely. First and foremost, you need to be clear and understandable.
Right. And you want to avoid any distracting mannerisms.
And eye contact is crucial, making sure you're connecting with your audience.
Once you've got those basics down, then you can start to think about things like timing, rhythm, and the overall flow of your speech.
Exactly. How to really use your delivery to enhance your message.
So let's talk about the different methods of delivering a speech. The chapter outlines 4 main ones. The first is reading from a manuscript.
Right. This is typically used when accuracy is paramount, like for official statements, technical reports, or maybe even a presidential address.
So in those situations, every word matters.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You can't afford to deviate from the script.
Now, it might seem like reading from a manuscript would be easy. Just read the words right.
It's actually harder than it looks, because you want to sound natural and conversational, even though you're reading.
And some people can do that really well. But for others, it can sound very stiff and robotic.
Yeah. You might hear someone stumbling over words, pausing in the wrong places, speaking in a monotone.
And it ends up sounding like they're just reading to the audience instead of talking to them.
So if you ever find yourself having to read from a manuscript, there are a few things you can do to make it more effective.
Like what?
First, practice. I'll practice reading it out loud until it sounds as natural as possible.
Makes sense.
And make sure you're looking up from the page and making eye contact with your audience. Don't get glued to the script.
Right. You want to connect with people.
And make sure the manuscript itself is easy to read. Clearly formatted, large font.
So you don't get lost.
Exactly. And most importantly, try to deliver it with sincerity and conviction, just like you would with any other type of speech.
Okay, what's the next method?
Reciting from memory.
Ah, the classic memorized speech.
This one is less common nowadays, except maybe for really short speeches like toasts, introductions, things like that.
Why is that?
Well, because it can be really challenging to memorize an entire speech and then deliver it effectively.
I can imagine. It's easy to get caught up in trying to remember what comes next.
Exactly. And that you lose that connection with the audience. You end up sounding robotic and distant.
So if you do choose to memorize a speech, You have to really know it inside and out.
Absolutely. Your focus should be on connecting with your audience,
Right.
not on desperately trying to remember the words.
All right, what about impromptu speaking?
This is when you have to speak with little or no preparation.
Like those moments when someone says, hey, can you say a few words? And you're completely caught off guard.
Exactly. Or maybe you're in a meeting and you need to respond to something someone said.
So what do you do in those situations?
The chapter says the most important thing is to stay calm. Don't panic. No one expects you to give a perfectly polished speech on the spot.
Right.
If you have a moment to gather your thoughts, jot down a few key points. But even if you don't, there's a simple 4-step method you can follow.
Okay, I'm listening.
First, state the point you're responding to. Make it clear what you're talking about. Then state your own point of view, your perspective on the issue.
Right.
Then support your point with evidence. Maybe a statistic, an example,
Yeah.
something concrete.
Okay, and then...
Finally, summarize your main point. Briefly reiterate your key takeaway.
So even if you're speaking off the cuff, you can still sound organized and coherent.
Exactly. It's all about having a simple structure to guide you.
And what about delivery? Like, how should you approach an impromptu speech?
Walk to the front calmly. Take a breath. Establish eye contact. And just start speaking. Even if you're nervous, try to project confidence.
Easier said than done, right?
It takes practice, but the more you do it, the easier it gets.
And the chapter also mentions using signposts.
Right, those little phrases that help your audience follow your train of thought, like first, second, in conclusion.
It's like giving them a roadmap.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And just like with any type of speech practice is key.
Okay, what about the last method, extemporaneous speaking?
This one sometimes gets confused with impromptu speaking, but they're actually different.
How so?
Impromptu is totally off the cuff. But with extemporaneous speaking, you do prepare and practice in advance.
But you don't memorize the whole speech word for word, right?
You use a set of notes or an outline to guide you, but the exact wording is chosen in the moment.
So you have a structure, but you're not tied to a script.
Exactly. It's kind of like having a conversation. You know what you want to say, but the exact words might vary each time.
I like that analogy.
And the chapter highlights that this method has a lot of advantages.
Like what?
Well, it gives you more control over your thoughts and language than impromptu speaking. But it also allows for spontaneity and directness, more so than reading from a manuscript or reciting from memory.
So it's kind of the best of both worlds.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it really encourages that conversational quality that audiences find so engaging.
That sounds like you're just talking to us, kind of feel.
Exactly. And the chapter mentions a video example of a student giving an intro to a speech about the Statue of Liberty.
And he does a really good job of speaking extemporaneously.
He does. You can tell he's prepared. He knows his stuff. But he's not just reading or reciting. He's choosing his words in the moment, making eye contact. It feels very natural and conversational.
And there's actually research that suggests that conversational delivery makes speakers seem more credible and trustworthy.
That's interesting.
Yeah. People are more likely to believe you if you sound like you're just having a conversation with them.
And the good news is that most people can become quite good at extemporaneous speaking with practice.
It just takes time and effort.
Right. And most experienced speakers and teachers prefer this method over the others.
All right, so we've talked about the different methods of delivering a speech. Now let's get into the specifics of using your voice.
Yes. The instrument of communication.
The chapter starts by saying that everyone's voice is unique.
And that's a good thing. There's no one perfect voice.
Right. Even famous speakers like Abraham Lincoln and Winston Churchill had voices that weren't traditionally considered good.
But they learned to use their voices effectively.
So it's all about understanding your own voice and learning how to control it.
Exactly. The chapter breaks down several aspects of voice that you should focus on.
Let's go through them.
All right. First up is volume.
How loud or soft you speak.
And while we have microphones and amplification nowadays, there are still plenty of situations where you'll be speaking without any assistance.
Like in a classroom or a small meeting room.
Exactly. So you need to be able to adjust your volume accordingly.
Not too loud, not too quiet.
Right. You don't want to blast people out of their seats. But you also don't want them straining to hear you.
And it's important to remember that your own voice always sounds louder to you than it does to your audience.
That's true. A good tip is to look at the people furthest away from you. If they seem like they're having trouble hearing, you need to speak up.
Okay, next is pitch.
The highness or lowness of your voice.
And the chapter explains that this is determined by how fast your vocal cords vibrate.
And changes in pitch are called inflections.
Which are super important for conveying meaning and emotion.
Right. The chapter uses the example of Sherlock Holmes saying, aha.
Imagine how the pitch of his voice would change, depending on whether he just solved the case or hit a dead end.
Exactly. In everyday conversation, we use inflections all the time without even thinking about it.
But when you're speaking in public, it's important to be aware of your pitch and make sure you're using it effectively.
Because if you speak in a monotone, it can be very boring for your audience.
It's like a lullaby.
Exactly. And even if you're not speaking in a true monotone, you might still fall into repetitive pitch patterns, which can be just as monotonous.
So how do you avoid that?
The chapter recommends recording yourself speaking and then listening back to see if you notice any patterns.
That makes sense.
And then you can consciously work on varying your pitch to make your voice more interesting and expressive.
Okay, what about rate?
This is how fast or slow you speak.
And the chapter says that a typical speaking rate in the U.S. is between 120 and 150 words per minute.
But there's no one right rate. It depends on your speaking style, the content of your speech, your audience.
Right. Some people naturally speak faster than others.
Exactly. And sometimes you might want to slow down to emphasize a point.
Or speed up to create a sense of urgency.
But the important thing is to avoid the extremes.
Too slow and people get bored. Too fast. And they can't follow what you're saying.
Exactly. And a lot of novice speakers tend to rush through their speeches because they're nervous.
So again, recording yourself can be really helpful to see how fast you're actually speaking.
And you can even make notes on your speaking outline, like reminders to slow down or speed up at certain points.
Okay, next up is pauses,
The power of silence.
which can be really hard for new speakers.
It can. It feels weird to just stop talking in the middle of a speech.
Especially when you're nervous.
But pauses are so important. They give your audience time to process what you've just said.
And they can add emphasis to certain points.
The chapter quotes Mark Twain, who said, "The right word may be effective, but no word was ever as effective as a rightly timed pause."
I like that.
And learning how to use pauses effectively takes practice.
But it's worth it.
Absolutely. It adds another layer to your delivery.
Now, one thing to avoid is vocalized pauses,
Those ums and ahs and yes.
which can be really distracting.
They can. And they make you sound less confident and less prepared.
So it's something to be aware of
Yeah.
and try to eliminate from your speech,
Definitely. Okay, next up is vocal variety.
which is basically using all of the elements we've talked about so far to make your voice more interesting and engaging.
Right. Varying your volume, your pitch, your rate. Using pauses effectively. It all comes together to create vocal variety.
And the chapter gives an example of a commencement speech that was praised for its vocal variety.
Yeah, it was described as captivating and inspiring.
And the speaker apparently received a standing ovation.
So clearly, vocal variety can have a powerful impact.
And the chapter suggests that the key to developing vocal variety is to approach your speech with conviction and enthusiasm. Like you genuinely care about what you're talking about.
Which makes sense. If you're passionate about your topic, it will naturally come through in your voice.
Exactly. Okay, moving on to pronunciation.
How to say words correctly.
And the chapter points out that everyone mispronounces words sometimes.
Yeah, we've all been there.
It happens. And the chapter provides some common examples like genuine, arctic, early, nuclear.
Words that people often trip over.
And it's interesting to think about why we mispronounce words.
Like, why do we say things wrong, even though we know how they're supposed to be pronounced?
Well, sometimes it's because we've only ever seen the word written down.
So we haven't actually heard it pronounced correctly. Right, or maybe we learned it wrong when we were younger, and the mispronunciation just stuck.
Like a bad habit.
Exactly. And often we're not even aware that we're mispronouncing words,
Until someone points it out to us.
which is why it's so important to practice your speech in front of other people.
They can catch those errors that you might miss.
And if you're ever unsure about how to pronounce a word, look it up in a dictionary.
Okay, what about articulation?
This is different from pronunciation. It's about the clarity and distinctness of your speech sounds.
So you can pronounce a word correctly,
Yeah.
but still not articulate it clearly,
Right, like mumbling or slurring your words.
which can make it hard for people to understand you.
And the chapter gives some examples of common articulation errors, like saying, "let me," instead of "let me," or "gonna" instead of "going to."
So basically, it's about being crisp and clear with your speech.
Exactly. And just like with pronunciation, it takes practice to improve your articulation.
But it's definitely worth it.
It makes a big difference in how you come across as a speaker.
Okay, last but not least, dialect.
This refers to regional or ethnic variations in language.
Like how people in different parts of the country might have different accents or use different slang.
Exactly. And the chapter points out that no one dialect is inherently better or worse than another.
But in the context of public speaking, Your dialect can affect how your audience perceives you.
That's right.
So what's the advice?
Well, if your audience is familiar with your dialect and it's appropriate for the occasion, then it's fine to use it.
But if you're speaking to a more general audience, you might want to consider using a more neutral dialect.
Like what's called General American, which is the dialect you typically hear on national news broadcasts.
So it's about being aware of your audience and adjusting your dialect accordingly.
Exactly. It's all about effective communication.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground with the voice. Now let's move on to body language.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because it's just as important as your voice.
The chapter starts with an analogy about observing people at a party.
How we form impressions of them based on their posture, their gestures, their eye contact.
Even before they say a word.
Exactly. And the chapter points out that body language can actually override what we say.
So if you say, "I'm so happy to be here," but your body language says, "Get me out of here,"
People are going to believe your body language.
that's fascinating.
It is. And it highlights the importance of being aware of our nonverbal cues.
So the chapter then gets into the specifics of using body language effectively.
Starting with personal appearance.
What you wear and how you groom yourself.
And the chapter uses examples like Lady Gaga and Albert Einstein to illustrate that some people can get away with unconventional attire.
Right, because they have a certain persona or reputation.
Exactly. But for most of us, especially in professional or formal settings, appearance matters.
It's the first thing people see.
And it shapes their initial impression of you.
So it's important to dress appropriately for the occasion.
Absolutely. You want to look professional and put together.
Now, of course, a great speech can sometimes overcome a less than ideal appearance.
True. But it's always best to put your best foot forward.
All right, next is movement.
How you move your body while you're speaking.
And the chapter describes some common nervous mannerisms that new speakers often exhibit.
Like pacing back and forth, shifting their weight, fidgeting with their hands.
Or just standing completely still and rigid.
Right. And these mannerisms are usually a result of nervousness.
So the key is to be aware of them and try to control them.
Exactly. And the chapter also emphasizes the importance of how you move before and after your speech.
Like how you approach the lectern and how you leave the speaking area.
You want to appear calm and confident.
So no rushing to the front or bolting for the exit as soon as you're done.
Right. Take your time, establish eye contact with the audience before you start speaking, and maintain that eye contact after you finish.
Okay, what about gestures?
Using your hands and arms to emphasize points.
And the chapter says there's a lot of conflicting advice out there about gesturing.
There is, but the main thing is that your gestures should be natural and spontaneous.
Not forced or awkward.
Right. And they should help to clarify or reinforce your message.
Not distract from it.
So avoid things like flailing your arms around or constantly fiddling with your jewelry.
And just focus on communicating naturally.
Exactly. And the chapter even mentions a video example that shows good gesturing technique.
Okay, last but not least, eye contact.
The windows to the soul.
The chapter really emphasizes the importance of eye contact.
It's how we connect with people, how we gauge their sincerity, how we build trust.
And in public speaking, eye contact is crucial.
Absolutely. It shows that you're engaged with your audience, that you care about what you're saying.
And the chapter says that you should aim to make eye contact with your audience for 80 to 90% of the time.
That's the general guideline.
But it's not just about looking at people. It's about how you look at them.
Right. You want to make eye contact with individuals throughout the room, not just focus on one spot.
And your eye contact should convey confidence, sincerity, conviction.
Exactly. And the chapter provides a video example of good eye contact in a speech about volunteering for the Special Olympics.
Okay, so we've talked about all the key elements of voice and body language. Now let's talk about practice.
Because you can't just read about this stuff. You have to actually do it.
And the chapter provides a 5-step method for practicing your speeches.
Let's break it down.
All right, first step, go through your preparation outline aloud.
This is where you make sure your speech flows well, that it's within the time limit, that your main points are clear.
And that your supporting materials are strong.
Right. And don't be afraid to make revisions at this stage.
Okay, second step, prepare your speaking outline.
This is the outline you'll actually use during your speech, so make sure it's easy to follow.
Use a clear visual framework, large font,
Ah,
any delivery cues you need.
exactly.
Okay, step 3, practice aloud using only your speaking outline.
This is where you really start to get comfortable with the flow of your speech.
And you might forget things at first.
Yeah.
But that's okay.
It's all part of the process.
The important thing is to keep practicing until you can deliver the speech smoothly and confidently.
Right. And if you're using visual aids, make sure to incorporate those into your practice session.
Okay, step 4, polish and refine your delivery,
This is where you work on those finer points.
like your eye contact, your facial expressions, your gestures.
And this is a good time to practice in front of a mirror.
Or record yourself
Yeah.
so you can see and hear how you're coming across
And it's also helpful to practice in front of other people.
to get their feedback.
Exactly, because they can give you a fresh perspective.
All right, step 5. Give a dress rehearsal.
This is where you practice your speech under conditions as close as possible to the real thing.
So if you can practice in the actual room where you'll be giving the speech.
That's ideal.
And the goal of the dress rehearsal is to get to a point where you feel confident and prepared.
Like you're ready to go out there and knock it out of the park.
And the chapter emphasizes the importance of starting your practice early.
Don't wait until the last minute,
Give yourself plenty of time to prepare.
because the more you practice, the better you'll get.
Okay, last but not least, let's talk about answering audience questions,
The Q&A.
which can be a make or break part of any presentation.
It can. You can give a great speech, but then completely fumble the Q&A.
Or you can give a decent speech and then really shine during the Q&A.
Exactly. So it's important to take it seriously.
And the chapter outlines 2 main steps for preparing for the Q&A.
First, you need to think about what questions your audience might ask.
So anticipate those questions.
And write out your answers in advance.
That way you're not caught off guard.
Right. And for persuasive speeches, think about potential objections or counter-arguments.
And be prepared to address those.
Exactly. And for technical topics, be ready for both specific and general questions,
You might even want to create a handout with more detailed information.
in case someone has a really in-depth question.
Okay, and the second step is to practice delivering your answers,
Just like you practice your main speech.
so you can deliver your answers smoothly and confidently.
Right. You can have someone ask you the questions and then give you feedback on your responses.
Or you can record yourself and then listen back to see how you sound.
The goal is to be clear, concise, and to the point.
And while you can't anticipate every single question,
Thorough preparation will help you handle whatever comes your way.
all right, so you've prepared for the Q&A. Now, how do you actually manage it?
Well, the chapter emphasizes the importance of having a positive attitude.
Like you're genuinely happy to answer people's questions.
Exactly. Even if the question seems obvious or repetitive.
You don't want to be dismissive or condescending.
Right. And you also want to stay calm and composed, even if someone asks a hostile question.
Don't get defensive or argumentative.
Just answer the question calmly and respectfully.
And it's important to listen carefully to each question.
Give the person asking the question your full attention.
And if you don't understand the question, ask for clarification.
It's better to be sure than to answer the wrong question.
And when you answer a question, make sure you're directing your response to the entire audience.
Not just the person who asked the question.
Right. You want to make eye contact with everyone.
And for larger audiences, it's helpful to repeat or paraphrase the question before you answer.
That way everyone can hear it.
Exactly. And it gives you a moment to gather your thoughts.
And above all, be honest. If you don't know the answer to a question, just say so.
Don't try to bluff your way through it.
It's better to admit you don't know and offer to follow up later.
Right. And be mindful of the time.
Don't let one person dominate the Q&A.
Give everyone a chance to ask a question.
And if someone starts giving a speech instead of asking a question,
Gently steer them back on track.
and finally know when to end the Q&A.
Don't let it drag on too long.
Give a few final questions, and then wrap it up.
Exactly.
So there you have it, a comprehensive overview of nonverbal communication in public speaking.
We covered a lot today.
We did, from the basics of good delivery to the specifics of voice and body language.
And we talked about the importance of practice and how to handle audience questions.
So hopefully you feel equipped to go out there and give amazing speeches.
I hope so.
Now, one final thought for you to consider.
Yes.
The next time you see a speaker who you find particularly engaging, take a moment to really analyze their delivery.
What is it about their voice, their body language, that makes them so effective?
And see if you can identify any techniques that you can incorporate into your own speaking style.
Because becoming a great speaker is a continuous journey.
It's all about learning and growing and constantly striving to improve.
Absolutely.
So keep practicing, keep experimenting,
Yeah.
and most importantly, keep speaking.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for joining us today.
It was my pleasure.
Until next time.
See you, Chad.